Hello. Thank y'all for having me at Roswell Reads. This is the workshop portion of the show, or as I like to call it, how to write about your people and not get killed. And it's really very simple writing about family. Just write in color. Write the way that they talk. I was lucky. I was born into a family of people who could make you hear the chains rattling in the pocket of the deputy as he chased them down a dirt road. And they could talk about a baby that was born and you could see every inch of it. They could talk about a funeral and remember every word of the funeral where they tried to preach him into heaven, which with my people was more than a little bit hard. But I grew up with talkers. I grew up with the best storytellers on the planet. But not everybody does. That's why it's important to write. Not when I say write in color, what I mean is to write as richly and as vividly and as thoughtfully as is true. It's kind of like coloring in a coloring book. If you're taught as a child to color within the lines, and that's a good idea for nonfiction. Think of those lines as the truth. But I think it's just as big a sin to leave out color, to leave out the vivid show me, don't tell me nature of work. That just dulls it out. I mean, think about it. How many of y'all have had a rice cake? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Those styrofoam packing material kind of things that they convinced us back in the 80s were good for us. I doubt many of you ever enjoyed a rice cake. But then think about a sausage gravy over a hot biscuit. I bet most of you enjoyed that. My point is that writing should be redolent with flavor. It should be rich and inviting. And it should be gothic where it needs to be and funny where it needs to be. But that old rule of save it for your novel or wait and, that's too florid. If I'm going to make a mistake, I'm going to make a mistake on the side of too florid, too rich, too colorful. I'm not going to make a mistake on the side of too terse and too dry and too damn dull. I'm just not going to do that. The first page of my first book, All Over But the Shouting, needed to explain why my mother's life was so hard, why she had to raise 3 boys by picking cotton and working as a maid and literally sometimes digging ditches. And the answer of why she had to do all that was my father. But I didn't want to begin by whining. I didn't want to begin the book by talking about woe is her. I wanted to begin with an image, with color. And I thought, what in my whole life, what one little thing sums up what she had to do? And I thought about redbirds. So the first page of All Over But the Shouting is, I used to stand amazed and watch the redbirds fight. They would flash and flutter through a sky unbelievably blue, swirling, soaring, plummeting, like burning rags. And I've seen grown men stop what they were doing, stop pulling corn or lift their head out from under the hood of a broken down truck just to watch it. And once, when I was little, I watched one of those birds peck itself to death in the side mirror of a truck, hurling itself against that unyielding image until the glass was cracked and smeared with blood. And I asked an old man who worked for my Uncle Ed, an old snuff-dipping man named Charlie Bivens. I said, Charlie, why do you reckon that bird did that? And he told me it was just its nature. So the bird, of course, was my dad. Some Southern men just hate what they see in the mirror. And they kind of peck themselves to death over time. But good writing doesn't have to be fancy like that. It doesn't have to be metaphor, simile. And the honest God truth is, sometimes I don't know the difference between a metaphor and a simile. Somebody told me once in like 1972, but I've long since forgotten. But just images, just color, just describe, and it'll work. And that's the only real trick I have. I'm kind of a one-trick pony. I don't teach writing as a thing that you can look at a worksheet and figure out how to do. It needs to be color. So why don't we just talk a little bit now and take some questions and we'll see what we come up with. What do y'all want to know? Well, I don't know a writer, a good writer, who doesn't love to read. I've never met one. I don't think such an animal exists on this planet. I tell younger people and older writers that you can read what you're told to read, and then you can read what you love to read. And somewhere in that mix, for a young writer in particular, you discover something about writing. And then sometimes you're made to read things that become things you love to read. So when your English teacher, points her bony finger in your face and says, you must read some Tennyson. Read some damn Tennyson. When the Gulf was almost destroyed by BP, when an oil company, something is selfish as a board of directors, almost ruined a significant and beautiful portion of the planet, and then could not fix that mistake out of ineptitude. I guess a lot of people thought about the science of it, but I thought about Tennyson, about a quote from Tennyson about how can you cast in endless shade what is so wonderfully made. And that's what had happened. That beautiful, clear, blue-green water had a plume of dark stain rolling through it. I wouldn't have known that if an English teacher a long time ago hadn't pointed that bony finger at me and forced me to read some Tennyson. I wouldn't have understood the civil rights movement nearly as much if I had not been forced at some point to read To Kill a Mockingbird, which became kind of a morality play for us down here, and explained to me in a beautiful story. And sometimes it takes a beautiful story to explain things to us. Explain to me things that I already felt, things I already knew. But Harper Lee put it in a beautiful tale. I fell in love with the Southwest because of Larry McMurtry, Lonesome Dove, which may be my favorite book of all time. I started to love reading in the beginning because of the Hardy Boys. I started to love to read the way that a lot of children now feel about Lemony Snicket, which I used to think was a throat lozenge. But I fell in love with reading through books I wanted to read, adventures and wars, and I read books about the Zulu in Africa, and I read books about the Indian of the American West, and I read books about the Bismarck battleship in World War II. And I read, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I read. And somewhere along the way, you kind of figure out how to lean the words against each other so that they don't all fall down. Somewhere along the way, you figure out that there is it's like putting a puzzle together. I can't do math. I can't do any math. I admire people who can. And I admire people who love the sciences. And I love the sciences too, but I don't understand them. I can't do long division. Yet I just love the thought of like space exploration and I love the idea of black holes and but I figured out the writing. Some people may not think so, but I figured out the writing. And I did it by reading those things. In the Deep South, Charles Frazier's Coal Mountain. I'll never forgive him for writing such a hopeless book, but it sure is beautiful. Ron Rash's poetry about cotton mill workers. I don't even like poetry. But I love what he does in writing about my people. And I could just keep going and keep going ad nauseum. But I think you read. I think as a young writer, you read the good writers. Read some Chekhov and read some. It ain't gonna hurt you. It ain't like being beat with a stick. Read. Read some Faulkner. I mean, he doesn't know where the comma goes, but he's still a great writer. Read Hemingway. Read Old Man in the Sea. Read Eudora Welty's short stories. Where is the voice coming from? But also read that dog-eared science fiction book that you've always wanted. Read Bradbury. Read, if you love horror, read Peter Straub's Ghost Story. But also read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you love, I grew up in a house where there were two, and this is not a cliche, where there were two books. There was the King James Bible, and there was the Spring Seed Catalog. I still, to this day, think that a picture of a radish is one of the most beautiful things on the planet. And couldn't figure out why you couldn't grow carrots in red clay. But I did read enough of the Bible to figure out where the adventures were. About, the blowing of the ram's horn and David and Goliath and Jonah and the whale. So you will find things to love if you try hard enough. The great danger to writers in the 21st century is we are mesmerized by our phones. I don't believe anybody is really going to read War and Peace on their phone. I don't believe anybody is really going to read Huckleberry Finn on their phone. I don't believe they're going to read True Grit. I don't believe they're going to... I just don't think they're going to do it. So, yeah, I think that we live in an age where reading is kind of endangered. And believe me, that will kill it if we don't encourage and give especially young people a reason to read. I hate my phone. I hate my phone the way some people hate like going to the dentist for a root canal or hate, hives or a rash or being punched in the nose. I hate my phone. My phone is a tool. But I don't love my phone. I don't want to watch, Gone with the Wind on it. I don't want it to be my lifestyle. I don't want to play a game on it. I don't want to watch the Final Four or the national championship game on it. I think it's just I think that marketing has fooled us into thinking that we got to love our phones. I'd rather love a book. I'd rather be seen with a copy of a good newspaper, as obsolete as they may seem, under my arm, than have my nose glued to my phone. I'd rather be seen with a good book. Well, that's a good question, and it kind of goes back to how we got started, and that is being able to see things. And when I say that, I don't even necessarily mean always vision, but being able to absorb and soak up the things around you, being able to describe, being able to one, see it, then be able to describe it, and to write in color. Chekhov, and believe me, I'm not going to quote Anton Chekhov very much in any writing talk. For one, it sounds funny coming out of my accent. But Chekhov always said, don't tell me the moon is shining or that the moon is beautiful. Show me the glint of moonlight on broken glass. I think that a lot of good writers will say, well, it was beautiful. And that's fine, but you need to say why, how. You need to not just draw people into a story, but you need to show them not just how you saw, but how you felt. The first paragraph of Ava's Man, and we were lucky with the first two books. The fact that you could write about poor people in the foothills of the Appalachians and somehow get people to care about them, get people on the Upper East Side or in San Francisco or in London to care about them. And I think one of the ways we got people to care about them was with it. We wrote it in color. And the first page of Ava's Man was, she was old all my life. Even when I was little, squatting in the red dirt, fascinated with my own toes, Ava's face had a line in it for every hot mile she ever walked and for every fit she ever threw. Her eyes behind her yellowed, thick sunglasses were pale, pale blue. And the blind have eyes like that. But Ava could see fine. Ava could see forever. She could tell your fortune by staring into the dregs of your coffee cup. And knew that if your feet itched, you would walk on strange ground. And that's not just saying her nose was this long and her ears were this big, but you're still describing. You're writing in color. And if you write in color, then the reader will go with you. And if I was wrong about that, I'd probably still be driving a tractor. And I mean that. There ain't nothing wrong with driving a tractor. As a matter of fact, there are many days in the writing business where driving a tractor seems like a real good idea. But I believe it works because after about 1 million people walk up to you and tell you it did, you might ought to believe them. But I think that is one thing. The other is, and this is something that young and old writers need to understand, is clarity. Clarity. If you're thick, if your writing is fat and thick, and the reader has to kind of muddle around inside it, then all the color in the world or the sharp imagery in the world will fail. So it needs to be clear, it needs to be fresh, it needs to be clean. And then you can add those or weave into it. You don't tack good color on to good writing. But then the pretty images, which are just as important in that good writing as the facts are, to getting the reader, to holding the reader, then you get the best of it. You know, I never have understood why thick, doughy food is good. You know, like when my mother made a biscuit, mostly what you seemed to taste was butter and bacon grease. And that was because it wasn't that high. It was that high. And it's perfect. Maybe that's what we need to shoot for. That's a good question. I don't ask them for permission unless it is something that I think would hurt them. And if it's something that I really think would hurt them, it probably never saw the light of day. I'm very fortunate in that while there was killing and fighting and cutting and finger biting, my great-grandfather, Jimmy Jim, bit a fella's finger off and put it on the mantle till his wife threw it out in the yard and the chicken got it. But, see, we're not ashamed of any of that. I mean, I hate to say this, and it is a tragedy, but a good killing, you know, just a good killing with honorable, or at least some provocation, is not something that my people are ashamed of. In the new book, The Best Cook in the World, There's a fleshing out of a story, which is a terrible choice of words, where my grandfather, my great grandfather, killed a man in a knife fight at a place called the Mill Branch, and I mean, there should be shame involved in that, but time has an amazing way of turning tragedy into literature. And leaving us with a ghost. And writing about ghosts is fun, especially if you know the backstory. Now I forgot the damn question, but I think my people have rarely ever, and I mean rarely, and I can count maybe on one hand the amount of times people say, "Boy, I wish you hadn't said that." I did have here in this town, in Jacksonville. We're sitting in Jacksonville, Alabama, my closest thing to hometown I have. I was born actually in Piedmont Hospital up the road, but here at Jacksonville State. But I gave a talk on campus, and here we don't really. Here we do most of our big talks in the auditorium, and I was going to do a talk here, and my cousin Carlos Slatt, who is the only person named Carlos, I think, that was born in the foothills of the Appalachians that we know of. And Carlos, we pronounce it Carlos, called me up and he said, "Rick, you might not need to make that talk at JSU." And we'd have 700, maybe 800 people. And he said, you might not need to come up here and do that. Your cousin, I'm not going to give you his name, says if you show up in town, he's going to cut you. And I said, well, was he offended by something I wrote? He said, I don't think he can read. And I said, well, what's he offended by? Well, he heard somewhere that you'd said something about your granddaddy Bobby. He didn't like it. So he said next time you came to town, he's going to cut you. And well, first off, that's not the first time that threat's been uttered in my lifetime. It's kind of like when a newspaper sent me out on an alligator hunt. That wasn't my first rodeo where that was concerned. It's just that the others had been illegal. And so Carlos convinced me that we should go talk to the authorities. So we went to the police and said, look, there's probably nothing to this, but just in case a man rushes up on stage with a case pocket knife, probably ought to have somebody getting away. And when it came time to do the talk, there were like 3 or 4 of the biggest. We grow them big down here, and 3 or 4 of the biggest policemen I've ever seen that were like standing around me, and I literally had like a bodyguard and it was just shameful. And of course, he didn't bother to show. And so my people don't. There was nothing in our history that we would have considered shameful. Many people doing biography, many people doing autobiography, doing memoir, they have a pain, something that other people might see as a shame, but they have a pain in their lives that they somehow find the courage to write about. I was spared that. My mother was a hero for me. She really did raise me by going 18 years without a new dress so that I'd have school clothes. She really did work as a maid. She really did scrub floors in houses right over here on the east side. So, the violence in, especially some of the men in my family, God help us, but we just never considered that. We just never considered that to be necessarily shameful. Although looking back on it as a 60-year-old man, I see the shame in it. My daddy raised fighting chickens, and he raised dogs to fight in the pits. I consider that now shameful. But sometimes in life, God help us, there is room for a violent man. And Daddy really did kill a communist soldier by holding his head underwater. Daddy really did save my life one time when he came in fairly well drunk, and I had the croup, and it had closed off my airway. And my mother was holding me, doing everything she could, and I was turning blue. I was dying. And he kind of plucked me out of her arms, and I was maybe 5, and he told her to get the salt box. And she came back, and she poured a handful for him. And I had clenched my teeth together because I was dying. And he closed his fist around that salt, and his plan was to knock my teeth out so that he could get the salt. And I was seeing that. I opened my mouth, and he shoved the salt down in it, and that cleared my airways when that happened. And so sometimes you need a violent man. But yeah, I have, every now and then someone will get mad, like my Aunt Juanita. On the second book, Ava's Man, I was at a theater talk down in Florida, and the theater was jam-packed, and we were getting ready to sign books, and we had these hundreds of people in line, and I got 2 calls. One was from my editor telling me that we were at number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list. And then the second one was from my Aunt Juanita. And I said, well, what'd you think? And she said, well, it's all right. And I said, what's wrong with it? She said, well, it just seemed like all you had Daddy doing was making liquor. And I said, well, he made it for 30 years. She said, well, but he never made very much at one time. So you never know what people... My mother disliked one thing. She told me, she said, reading about all that in a book isn't going to hurt me. But she said, did you have to mention about my false teeth? And she got false teeth at Pell City, which everyone knows is the denture capital of America. And they didn't fit right. So on the way back, she spit them out in the weeds on the side of Interstate 20. And she thought that I could have not mentioned that. So you never know about folks. You never know what they're going to find to be snitty about. Well, first of all, I don't know if I'll write about family in nonfiction again. I'm sure that I have kinfolks who will rise up from the real world that will enter into fiction. Because I think just about everybody does do that, like we talked about before. But I do think that in some ways, thank goodness I had the stories and my memory was still sharp enough. And it's beginning to dull a bit. But thank God I had the stories in hand. My mother's memory has not dulled at all. You know, she's 82 and her memory has not dulled at all. And she remembers 1947 better than she remembers last week. So, but I think that the nonfiction telling of my people is in its twilight because we're just losing them. And last year, 2 years ago, I gave the eulogy. Because I'm the writer guy, I get called on to do the eulogies. Even though I may not know the people nearly as well as the many others sitting around. But when my Uncle Jimbo, my Uncle James died, my Uncle James was the best storyteller that ever lived. He was the best that ever lived. If you saw him hanging out at the food outlet grocery store, which is shut down now, and you walked up to him, and he'd be there in a little Honda Civic, and he's like 6'3", so you know he'd have to bend double to get in that little car. It had like 500,000 miles on it, and you know he'd just be hanging out at the grocery store, and he was pushing on 100 then, and you'd say, "What you been doing, Jim?" And, you know, he'd say, "Well, son, I've been hanging out at the cemetery." Why are you hanging out at the cemetery? You know, as a Southern writer, I thought, you know, gothically, you know, that he was, you know, walking between the tombstones, talking to the people he'd lost, because they were the only people who could appreciate the stories that he had to tell. But no, that wasn't it. He said, "Well, son, that's where the widow women are." So he was going there to date. So as we buried him, you know, it was in this beautiful little country cemetery, and he was buried right up against the woods, which I think was appropriate. You could hear a bridge fall. You could almost hear the hands of a clock, some great big old-fashioned tower clock bang into place, and time finally passed us by. Because nobody lied and yarned better than Jimbo. You know, he was a carpenter and a roofer, and probably helped make a little whiskey. You know, he had hands the size of baseball mitts, and he was that big around, and could catch a fish just by like looking at the water, and God, could he lie? You know, I love the way that man lied. So I don't know. I don't know what. I think we will. You know, you never run out of kinfolks. You never run out of wacky kinfolks. Maybe we can tell some of the stories that I dare not tell in nonfiction and in fiction, like everybody does, I guess. That's hardly revolutionary. Yeah, well, see, I don't believe in the muse. I wrote a story once about this, magazine story. I don't believe in the muse. You know, we want to believe that the muse is this Tinkerbell looking thing. And it, you know, they're sitting there on their writing porch. I never will forget the first time somebody said, "Oh, I write on my writing porch. I write on an old, Underwood typewriter because only a Philistine would use electricity." Anybody who believes only a Philistine would use electricity needs to listen to Muddy Waters. Needs to listen to like a real good Grand Ole Opry steel guitar picker. But they believe that writing has to be picturesque. And they believe that they're sitting there on their writing porch underneath the willow tree. And they're typing on their manual typewriter, and they're not really getting anywhere. And then here comes the muse. The muse flits in the window on gossamer wings, flinging gold dust around, and it settles on their shoulder, and it leans in, and it whispers words of such beauty and power that their hands are just transformed, and they write words of such import that the paper actually catches on fire in the rollers, and they have to reach real quick and snatch it out and fling it across the room. And then they grab another sheet of paper and they put it in there, but it's too late. Because the muse, that fickle so-and-so, has done fled. Has left them. I've been to 1 million writing seminars to where I talk to people where I hear this word, and it's usually with a southern accent. "Did you write yesterday?" "No, I didn't write because the muse just wasn't on me." I don't think that's what the muse is. I think the muse is this hairy, little goat-like creature that is always stomping around you like worry or need. At night, it lays under the bed and it kicks the bed slats till you finally get up and maybe write down something, a thought that had got into your head. I think the muse is a contract. The muse is a deadline. Even if those contracts and deadlines are not with a New York literary agency or a New York publishing house, believe me, they can both put great pressure on you. But that contract, that deadline may be in your own head. It may be something that you've lived with for a decade or so. I think the muse is just worry. And it does. And if you write for a living, I've never been able to afford a book that didn't do well because, I was a blue collar guy, and I worked for newspapers, and I was honored to work for them. But when I started doing books, I knew that I would never be able to be that kind of writer who wrote when they wanted to or wrote when they felt like it. That there would be contracts, and after the first successful book, then there were contracts and there were expectations. And if a book made the bestseller list, and by God, the next book better make the bestseller list, if only for a moment in time. And the next one better make it. Because if they don't make it, you might not have failed, but you might not have the freedom to do the next book. So there is constant worry and constant need and constant deadline. And that's not a bad life. That beats the mortal hell out of roofing. You know. I used to like sling wet bales of hay around. You know. Slinging around a bale of hay is not a big whoop, but when they get wet, they weigh about 200 pounds. I hope to never do that again. Now, I still go get hog feed, and I still take my pickup and drive down and get horse feed and livestock feed and salt blocks. And I still do that. I do it because, you know, I got my mama a 40-acre farm and such things are necessary. But now I don't have to do it. And it's kind of like what Mark Twain wrote in Tom Sawyer about difference between work and play. That work is what a body is obliged to do, and that play is what a body is not obliged to do. I'm not really obliged to do that, but I do it. But if I ever have a real stinker, then I suspect I could always go back to hauling feed. But a day in my life is I sleep late because if I can. I sleep late because I see no reason to get up before 10. And life should really begin with lunch. That I love breakfast, but if I'm going to get breakfast, I have to go to one of them 24-hour places or have Mom make it. And I get up late, I look around, I eat some lunch, then I procrastinate for 4 hours. And late afternoon, I get to writing. But I'll also write until 3 a.m. Nighttime is a very good time to write. When the world gets quieter, it's a really good time to write. But usually I wait too late and I get crammed, I get kind of jammed in and I write. And I hurry and I do all the things you're not supposed to do. You know, I let expediency guide my writing life. I do everything wrong. Well, the pretty answer is it allowed me to save to save for maybe all time, as long as there are pages fluttering out there somewhere. The stories of the people that were not written about, excuse me, that were not written about very much. I'm not going to say I'm the first one to write about them. I'm sure not. But, Faulkner and even Harper Lee and a lot of great Southern writers wrote about my people in fiction. And they were kind of cliched. I know there's more to my people than that. I'm not saying we are without warts. We have many warts. But there is more to my people than the Snopeses. There's more to my people than the family that lived on the way to the city dump, where no amount of money would ever change their situation or make them less white trash than they were. I know that something good came out of writing about them in a way that showed a small amount of nobility and dignity. I didn't uncover it. It was always there. It's just putting a human face on it. So that is the pretty answer. The other answer is that, I bought my mama a house or two. I was able to make life easier much easier than it would have been. So that will always be in my heart. That will always be the thing I know that I can put a hand on. And maybe the other I can too. People tell me I can. People tell me I should, but sometimes there's just something about buying brick and mortar that makes you know that it worked. I guess the bottom line about writing is, for me anyway, is that if it's not rich, and I don't mean every line needs to be that way. You do need to give people a chance to catch their breath. But I do believe that it needs to be redolent with the things that make life worth living. And sometimes the things that make life terrifying and awful and, yes, even shameful. But it needs to be full of the living. Be full of the living. And I think if you accomplish that, then you win. And you'll know when you win, I think. I think you just can't help but know. And that's about all I've got in my limited brain about writing. I appreciate y'all listening to that much. It must have been a slow day there in Roswell. I can't imagine why y'all would bother to listen to me prattle on so long, but thank you for doing it. And hopefully you can find somebody that makes more sense the next time. Goodbye.